I'm in the middle of our hay crop, which will be feeding the horses this winter. This is quite similar to the type of hay that would have been gathered by medieval people to feed their animals over the winter. It's an absolutely essential piece of medieval harvest. I am surrounded by the hay we're going to cut with tractors. I am holding a modern scythe. I'm not very good at using the scythe, but I have used it a little bit. This is actually significantly smaller than a medieval grass scythe, but I'm going to show you a little bit about it later. This grassland though, I wanted to talk about it a little bit. We don't use any artificial fertilizer or weed killer or anything like that on this landscape. So the grass is semi-wild, and that means that for the horses, the hay consists of an awful lot of different types of grass, not just one type of grass. So all sorts of bits and bobs in the hay. Now for me, that means it's better for their diet. It's more variable. It's more like they would be eating and foraging naturally rather than just one particular type of hay. So this is probably quite similar to natural pre-industrial medieval hay. That's better for the horses. They perform better on it, we think, but it does mean it's a bit messier. I've had fellow farmers say to me, "Oh, your hay crop's looking a bit messy," and I go, yes it is, because we've got all these other bits and bobs. Might be called weeds, but I think of them as herbs in the mix. So I'm quite pleased with it, but it does look a little untidy at this stage. We will cut these 26 acres for hay and have many bales of hay for the winter to keep the horses going. We of course are going to cut this hay with tractors and big machines, and it's going to be cut in a day, all 26 acres. In the medieval period, the hay crop was cut usually around June, certainly by July, in between other parts of the harvest. And it was cut by hand by gangs of men and gangs of women and gangs of children. The men would be using the scythe, and they would form a row across the field and they would mow in one direction, cutting with the scythe itself and laying down the swathe of grass, which would then in turn be moved and sort of shaken out a little bit by the women following behind with hay forks. That would help spread it and help dry the hay. And then behind them come the children doing bits and bobs, tidying up, putting things in place. Hay cutting with scythes is actually really quite a physical task. And we see from the illustrations a lot of the medieval peasants, medieval workers, stripped down to their underclothes actually, which is quite amusing. Often their legs are completely bare. Quite often they've taken off their doublets and they're really scything in little more than their underlinen because it was so hot and so sweaty. In the medieval period, the amount of hay that a man with a scythe was supposed to be able to cut in one day was 1 acre, which is 1 chain by 1 furlong, or for those people that don't necessarily do the very old English style of measurements, 66 feet by 660 feet, which is actually quite a long strip of land if you think about it. And that 66 feet by 660 feet is actually designed that way because you're going to go in a straight line more or less for as long as you can. Rather than it being a square, it's quite an oblong. It's actually a 10-to-1 oblong. So if you think, it actually represents the shape of the landscape that would have been easier for a man with a scythe to cut, or somebody ploughing. You don't want to be turning around too much if you can possibly avoid it. You want to be steadily going in one direction. Now, interestingly, I almost think that an acre shouldn't be defined by measurements. It's actually a kind of working definition, if you like. So rather than saying it's an acre, you are also saying it's about 1 day's work. you're saying it's about 1 day's work to plough for one man and an ox. It's about 1 day's work for a scythe man to scythe down. So if you had a 5-acre field of hay in the medieval period, everybody would know that would take one man 5 days, or it would take 5 men 1 day. So it's a useful rule of thumb. And like most medieval or ancient measurements, they're not really designed for scientific accuracy. They're kind of designed to communicate ideas. So if you were to say, I have a 10-acre field of barley, everybody would kind of know how much work was going to be involved in sorting that 10 acres of barley out. Obviously, 1 acre of land could be very different in its productivity than another. So you have to remember there's good land and bad land. This field I'm standing in has good patches where the grass grows is very lush and very thick, and other areas that are a bit scrubby and don't grow particularly well. Even today, with the techniques we can use, that's still the case. There are good bits of land and bad bits of land. Farming in the medieval period was even more like that, I suppose. And undulating land or difficult land would be hard to actually mow or to scythe down. So the type of land you had would vary hugely, and the productivity of the land would mean that you could perhaps keep more of your animals alive over the winter. So if you had a good hay crop, well, you don't have to slaughter as many of your animals as you might have. If you had a bad hay crop, well, you've got to take steps to keep some of them alive, and therefore the harvest reflects what the coming season is going to be like and what you have to do. Once you had mown the hay will dry over 4 or 5 days. It needs to be turned every day. You turn it after the dew has evaporated in the morning, and sometimes you turn it again in the evening as well, just to make sure you're turning the wet side up. 4 or 5 days, maybe a little bit more, is what you need with sunshine, preferably a bit of wind, and it should make good hay, which is then stored. However, as the expression goes, you make hay while the sun shines. If it rains, the hay can be ruined. So you really have to time it quite carefully. And of course, June, in England at least, is quite unlikely to be very rainy, although people would disagree, and the clouds behind me look like it might rain. It takes at least 5 or sometimes 6 days to turn the grass into dry hay that's dry enough to store and keep over the winter. And of course, in medieval times, they didn't bale things in giant bales which were handled by tractors. Everything was put into ricks, put on a hay wain, which varied in size. Is a small cart, probably pulled by 1 horse. You'd pack that on top and then take it somewhere and stack it. There are lots of different ways of stacking hay, but the basic idea was try and keep some of the rain off the hay and try and keep it off the ground and try and keep vermin out a little bit if you could. There were lots of different ways of trying to do that. One of the things people talk about is stacking the hay on stones to try and keep the damp from going up into the hay. The other is to put a thick bed of bracken, because apparently bracken doesn't really drag the water up from the ground, and apparently bracken is quite vermin resistant, that rats and mice don't particularly like chewing it. I don't know whether that's true or not, but that's what the books say. So there are lots of different regional variations on how to store the hay. But basically what you're trying to do is dry it and then feed it over time to your animals to keep them alive until the next spring when the grass grows again. Just as in farming today, the crop you get from your hayfield can be incredibly variable. It depends on the weather, basically. It depends on the sunshine, it depends on nutrients, it depends on the amount of rain and when it falls. And so on a good year, when you had a big harvest, you had a lot of hay and you could keep a lot more of your animals alive over the winter, because that's what hay is. It's a way of displacing the grass. So the hay crop was an essential component of the decisions you're going to have to make for the next 6 months of the year. I have with me my modern scythe. This is similar to a medieval scythe. They varied hugely. Like lots of agricultural implements, there were regional variations, and a scythe in Northamptonshire was probably very different from the design of a scythe used in Scotland or Wales or or down on the south coast of England. So there is no particular standard scythe. The only thing that really they all share is the fact that it has this big curve which is very thin and very sharp and needs to be regularly sharpened, and it has this shaft which has handles, and the idea is your motion is to use your whole body, cut through, step forwards, cut through. So the action is a slicing action of the curve of the blade. And what you end up with is, when you do it properly, which I almost certainly won't be able to do, is a stack of grass on one side, nice and neatly piled. These, obviously the idea of a scythe touches on mythology, because of course death carries a scythe, and that was a big thing in the medieval period. The idea of the scyther of humans was a big thing, and you see that on illustrations on to do with heaven and hell. This device basically represents slicing things down, and for the medieval person would have represented sweeping away of the landscape. And of course scything people down is a pretty grim way of looking at how death handles things. So a scythe is actually an implement for collecting your hay crop, but is also would have featured heavily on the paintings in rural churches, both to represent life and of course death. I'm going to show you some scything and what it actually means. I am not very good at scything. I know a little bit about it. There are plenty of experts out there, lots of YouTube videos you can look up if you're interested in seeing an expert doing some scything. But I want to give you an idea of what it actually means. And I've always tried to do these things myself. So I'm going to do a little bit of scything and try and work out how tired I would be at the end of a full day of this kind of work. So let me have a go and let me show you what it looks like. The idea of the scythe is to get the blade as close to the ground as possible. So let's have a go. Well, I don't think I'm doing a particularly good job, but you can see how you can actually cut the hay. It's not close enough to the ground, but it's quite a workout. Doing an acre of this would be quite tiring. Let me have another go. It's actually quite addictive. It feels like one of those Zen exercises where you probably ought to be careful not to do too much. Well, all I can say is those chaps that did acres of this must have been fit as fiddles. That was quite hard work, and I've done a small strip of it really, although quite pleased with that. They must have been really tired at the end of the day, but they must have been as fit as butcher's dogs.